working with a sort of very limited color scheme, I do want you guys to see how I sort of mix things, how I sort of push the paint around, how much medium I'm adding. The medium is down here, so you can see the oleo gel. When I'm getting started, I like to mix, especially because the palette's so limited, I like to mix enough paint to where I can start really kind of laying in the entire painting pretty much. It doesn't mean that I'm automatically going to put all that paint on here. It's just so that I don't have to remix things. Paint dries gradually, right? Oil paint. And so I actually like the consistency of the paint to stay the same. If you, let's say, start a painting, 6 hours into it, you kind of run out of paint and you want to sort of mix another batch and you add medium to that batch, when you actually combine the two, it can sometimes do weird things. It starts to kind of wipe things out, especially if you have any mineral spirits or Gamsol involved. So starting out, I'm going to use a fraction of just a tiny bit of Gamsol. Gamsol is in my brush cleaner. It's basically like what you clean your brushes with. It's paint thinner. The only time I use a little bit of it is in the very, very beginning of a painting. Now, the color that I'm mixing is very similar to the color of my palette. And again, I'm going to add a tiny bit of the oleo gel. Different amounts of oleo gel basically changes the opaqueness of the paint. And so if I add a lot of oleo gel and just a little bit of paint, which I'm going to do later in the demo to show you guys what that does, you're basically creating more of a transparent, lighter version. Because what the oleo gel does, which I really like, is see how it's similar in consistency to the paint? So when you use even a lot of oleo gel, it still doesn't run. And so it's almost like almost like a watercolor oil that's very transparent. Now, I'm using 2 brushes for the initial mixture, just because I'm going to use both of these brushes when I'm painting. I mix almost always with brushes, unless I'm working on a big painting and I need like a lot of a specific color or something like that. Okay, let's see what this looks like. So usually I kind of mix a batch of color and then I just kind of test it. That works. I don't want it too red. I don't want it too blue. I want like a nice average shadow value color. And that's what I'm really after, because we're going to start by really primarily focusing on our shadow shapes. So first and foremost, I'm just going to kind of generally block in the entire shape. And so see how I'm kind of setting, not like the eye or the nose, but the actual shape and the major angles of the entire head. And I'm going to say, you know what? It's too central. I'm actually going to move her just a tiny bit over this way. So when you were asking how I'm composing her, it really depends on what I want to do. I kind of like the angle here going all the way to the corner more so, compositionally. And so I am going to bring the face right around here. Now also, see how I'm not worried about getting, the paint in areas that are going to be light. Like this is not going to be a shadow, but I don't mind. I'm just to demonstrate, because what we're actually doing is we're also coming in and we're going to wipe out with a paper towel. And so I want you guys to not be afraid of getting the paint in the wrong place. And when you're starting, don't use clumps of paint. See, apply it evenly, but also don't be concerned about neatness or the finished application or anything like that. Primarily focus on the drawing, just accuracy. Uh-huh. Yeah, thank you. Guys, everybody needs to mute themselves. Everybody. Thank you. Thank you for the interruption. That was very helpful. Yeah. So as I was saying, as I'm demoing, if you guys aren't muted, then you're there. You know, the rest of the class is going to see you instead of me. Which let's not do that. Okay. So right now, see how it's like the very sort of, you know, trying to capture the entire essence as quickly as possible, just the major shapes. And I use the paper towel, especially in the beginning, as much as the brush because, you know, you're adding paint, you're subtracting paint. And my entire process is very much based on adding and subtracting because it allows me to constantly adjust. And so I'm not, you know, hesitating to take risks. I just move things around and then make it work. Now, also, even the edges work better when you're erasing into them. So don't worry about having to come in to, you know, these shapes with the paper towel because if anything, especially for the shadow shapes, it makes them look better, not worse. Now, I'm not painting the nose. I'm trying to just sort of get my general spacing. So I'm saying, okay, if this is generally here, it still might get a little bit adjusted, but I'm trying to sort of place where the bottom of the chin is and approximately where the top of the head is. So then between these 2 points, I can find where the nose is, where the, you know, the eye is. Very often I'll start with the eyebrows. In this case, you know, we have her bangs mostly covering up the eyebrows. So I'm going to come in and kind of look at this angle, right? I'm going to say there is this general angle of the bangs and then the eye is kind of within here. And so I'm saying, okay, if this is here, we need a little bit more up here. And so see how I'm not focusing on any specific area. I'm trying to get the entire head very generally blocked in. And I'm already kind of thinking, okay, if this is here, we have the mouth here, that nose probably comes down just a little bit more. And see, even just the angle of the nose came a little bit flatter because she's tilted downwards. Now, I'm not even erasing this yet because I'm trying to keep things as simplified as possible right now. Now, another angle that I'm sort of right away wanting to get is sort of where is the ear? And so if we have the bottom of the nose here, see how I'm pulling that line all the way through from the nose to where the ear is? And then over here, I'm kind of triangulating, okay, if this is here, where is this? And I'm going to just, again, very quickly and loosely, instead of painting an ear, kind of separate those major shapes. Now, when you guys are starting to mix this stuff, careful not to add too much of the oleo gel. In the beginning, we're using just a bit, just very, very little. It's mostly the consistency of the fresh paint out of the tube. Now we also have, if this is here, we have this really nice block of hair here that helps us with this whole angle. And I also try to back away from the painting. You guys can't really see. Here, I'm going to show you what I mean really quickly. So if you look at me over here, right, I'm painting, I'm backing up, I'm painting, I'm backing up so that I can really see the entire thing from a bit more of a distance. I especially do that when I'm working from life. But it's a very good habit, especially when you're getting started. You want to go back and forth so that you're not like in here, you know, sticking your head in, getting super close. You want to have distance and have enough perspective to really see the whole thing. Now, I'm going to come in over here and just add a little bit more blue into the mixture for my hair, especially for some of these darker shadows. And this is also an older beat up brush, so it's going to sort of give me more of like a textured application. It's a little bit more blue than I want. And so I kind of also want to show you guys that even with a very limited palette, it doesn't mean that you don't think about color. It just basically means that you're simplifying the choices. And so, you know, if you're going darker and bluer, you add more ultramarine. If you want to go lighter and warmer, you add more of the burnt sienna. And just between these two colors, you can actually kind of control enough of a range to create a pretty solid underpainting, or especially in the shadow shapes. Like if you look at this color, it's actually pretty similar to the color of her shadow shapes on her face. And then this in here isn't that far off from the actual color of her hair. Now, you know, obviously some of the, you know, pinks in the cheekbone or the ear are going to need a slight variation of color if I want to completely match it. But you can do a lot with only two to three colors. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue, those are so far the only colors that I've used. The burnt sienna needs to be Winsor & Newton. It's the only burnt sienna I use. This is also Winsor & Newton ultramarine blue. So basically Winsor & Newton burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. Yeah, while we're here, does anybody have another question? Let's just take the first few questions right now, and then I'll continue for another 20 minutes with the demo. Any questions, guys? I like that. It just shows you how well I'm explaining everything, you know? No questions. Okay, make sure everyone's muted. What brush? I'm using two brushes. This is a number 3, this is a number 4. They're both rounds. These are Isabey's. I use the Trekell brushes just as much. It just depends on, you know, I just have so many brushes at home that, you know, I have a lot of different brands. These were actually, you know, gifted to me when I was doing a demonstration. So you don't have to actually get the actual brand names that I'm using, but they're both round bristle brushes, and one is number 3, one is number 4. I start all of my paintings with round bristle brushes, and the sort of bristle brushes are firm, and so they're really good for moving paint around, and then the further in the painting I get, the softer the brush becomes. Like if you're doing a very small detail type of thing, you're going to use sables and synthetics. When you're really moving paint around the entire surface, you're using bristle brushes. Any other questions? Because if not, we have to wait another 20 minutes before the next set of questions. And so I'm actually thinking about where the separations are. You know, this distance here against this distance here. Super important. I'm still thinking about the major angles. This entire angle over here. This angle over here. And I'm going to bring in a few other brushes and I'll kind of start explaining them as I bring them in. I use a lot of different types of brushes actually when I'm painting. So let me kind of show you guys. On the supply list, I had the cat's tongues. These two are both cat's tongues. One is number 10, one is number 8. Now, see how one is nice and sharp and the other one is kind of beat up? I use the same brush at different stages of its life for different things. And this one's completely frayed and beat up. This one's almost past its prime. And so this brush over here, I'm going to be using for precision, for like sharp little things, because it has a lot of control. Whereas this one, I'm going to be using to apply the midtones because it's softer. So I'm going to be doing the same thing that I'm doing with the bristle brushes. Just with this one, it's actually I'm going to add more oleo gel, and I'm going to use it more for the midtones. So let me kind of show you. I'm adding a little bit more oleo gel here, but not too much more. And so if I want to come in and like showcase the outside of the nose a little bit more, just to sort of start thinking about that, do it with that brush, and then again, I can come in and start cutting things with the paper towel. And so see how it's not like I'm trying to get it completely accurate in one pass. I'm intentionally, moving pretty quickly, throwing paint around. It's not about getting it right the first time. It's about pushing in the right direction, basically. So now I'm going to start actually getting into some of these shapes. And what I'm really doing is saying, is the nose still too high, right? I'm not actually trying to define the nose. I'm trying to make it a little bit more clear so that I can then start adjusting the distances. And so that's like a good general indicator of when to do what. Like if I'm trying to make everything work, I need to have enough information for my eye to even tell if it is working or not. And so I'm basically saying, okay, if that's here, if this is approximately there, I want to actually sort of generally guesstimate where, let's say if the lower lip is approximately here, kind of where is this, and do I have room for everything? And so I think this comes down a little bit. And I'm going to leave it super simplified. Like I'm not actually going to push this any further than this right now. I'm going to say that nose is actually approximately in the right place. I don't think I need to lower it. And then from here, I'm going to go right back to the major shapes of the face. Now the nose is sticking out a little bit too much, so I'm going to clip it back, which pushes this back a little bit. And so remember I was saying the major shape of the face to the shape of the hair. And so I'm going to go right back to that. So for instance, if this is here, right, then the bangs actually come out a little bit further. And you might be like, oh, why does that matter? It matters because that's, actually explaining the tilt of the entire head. And so bringing this out further makes her lean forward more, adds to the gesture, and explains the pose in a more interesting way. Generally speaking, shoot for a slightly exaggerated gesture versus something that's too stiff. Like in the beginning of a painting, you want to really think about the gesture. And then, after you've thought about the gesture, you can kind of come in and get a little bit more specific with the proportions, shapes. But if you don't capture the gesture early on, it's kind of hard to capture later. If you've anchored a bunch of features and got into details, you don't want to move those around. And the gesture is literally the relative position of the different parts to each other, right? If this is here, where is that angle versus this angle versus this angle? And so gesture is about the relative placement of different parts in relationship to each other. And so things are very mobile when you're thinking about gesture. They're not anchored. Now, I'm going to show you guys what I use these. I had them on the supply list, these Catalyst wedges. And then after I'm done using these, I'm going to screen a few questions because I'm sure they'll be there. Generally speaking, with the wedges, I also add a little bit more oleo gel. And so like this softer brush and this usually go together in my process. And then I'm going to pick up a little bit of paint. And I'm going to say, okay, if this is here, I think this comes out a little bit more. And see, I'm actually using this to make both sort of sharper lines. And then I can also drag it to put down like a flat, thinner shape. And again, it's not that important. Like, it's not like this is some sort of like, magical secret that's going to make you a better painter. But it's just kind of, fun and a good sort of explanation of sort of why I use some of these shapes and for what reason, or different tools and, for what reasons, basically. And again, see how I'm not fixated on any specific area. I keep moving, keep adding, subtracting, and sort of trying to prioritize the entire painting, not any specific area. So right now, guys, if there's any questions, go ahead and ask them. Awesome. I'll keep going. Oh yeah, go ahead. I can barely hear you. I think you need to turn your volume up. Or talk to the mic. Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, did you use alkyd oil to tone it, or did you use regular oil? Huh. Maybe you use too much Gamsol? You use this right here? I honestly, I don't know. The reason I use alkyd is to actually deal with that. So this, I literally use that tube of paint, and I let it dry for a day or two. Did you do it today? Oh yeah, that's why. You need to let it dry overnight, because as soon as you actually bring like the medium and the mineral spirits in, it's going to start lifting it. But once it's completely dry overnight, then it's fine. Absolutely. Any other questions? Super reasonable question, and straight lines, I could actually go on for like 3 hours to answer this question. So see how it's not just the hair, even the way that I'm blocking out the shape, right? You want to simplify and study shapes through straight lines, because a curve doesn't have any specific parameters, right? You can't actually, it's a guesstimation. Whereas I'm basically saying I'm simplifying things into the major angles. And from there, like let's say I have, one line here and then one line here. I can then come in and put another one in and see how now it's a curve, basically. And what it is it's the way to simplify. I also enjoy it stylistically as well. I used to, when I was drawing, I would only draw with straight lines. And like I wouldn't allow a single curve. And it allows you to study things more specifically. So for instance, right now I have this point here, and this point here. If you have a curve, you can't map the specific points. Like I can say, is this too high or is this too low, right? And then from here I can say, okay, well this actually needs to come in. So then I create another point here and create an angle from here to here. And then I can actually say, okay, well there's another one over here. So see what I'm saying? So you can actually control and map the way, the breakdowns of the angles. You create landmarks so that there's distances because there's concrete corners because you're using straight lines. I very much encourage you guys to try to keep things as straight as possible and actually cut into things with smaller sort of straight lines. Like for instance, I started this with one angle here, one angle here. Let's say this was 2 lines. Then I added another one. Now it's 1, 2, 3. And if you think about it, simplification is trying to capture something in the most simple way possible. And that's a lot of what studying drawing and painting actually is. It's learning how to simplify. And so straight lines really help with that whole process. So my suggestion is to actually start trying to break things down in straight lines. And then as you're going through that process, I think you'll start to gradually understand why. It's one of the most sort of universally taught principles in drawing, in classical drawing, period. Now, when you're more advanced, you can totally throw curves in and it's absolutely fine. A lot of times, and you'll see me come in, like I can do kind of a similar thing, but instead of doing different brush strokes, I can actually just turn the brush. But specifically for the demo, I'm keeping them straight because that's what I want you guys to really focus on. Okay, guys, any more questions? If not, make sure everyone's muted. Now, this is the sharper, cleaner cat's tongue. And what I do with this guy is, again, see how I'm using different brushes with the same paint mixture, just adding slightly more or less oleo gel? That's something that I also want you guys to pay attention to. This is the best way, in my opinion, to actually learn how to work with the paint. Because you're not in the mixtures, you're actually really exploring consistency. And a lot of that has to do with the surface that you're working with. So, you know, if you're working with a coarser, rougher surface, you would use, you know, slightly different consistency. If you're using, you know, a surface that's super smooth, it's, you know, different brushes are going to act differently on it. But see how with this guy, I can actually come in and make some lines. I could also simplify it a lot with this into a straight line. And that's, again, going back to why do I simplify things to a straight line? Because it forces me to simplify. I really like painting with these tools because I'm literally trying to figure out where to make these super straight, simplified placements, and it forces me to simplify. You know, if you start a painting with a little brush like this, you're not going to simplify. You're going to get into the details right away. And, you know, the simplification process is one of the most important things to study. That's also where styles and you know, specific tastes come out of. Now, I use this a lot too. This is a rubber-tipped sculpting tool, technically. It was on the supply list. It's a clay shaper, basically. And some of them come softer, some firmer. The dark gray ones are the firmer ones, which I like. And what I do with this is I'm basically just using sharp rubber tip to move the paint around. And so it's kind of like exactly the same thing that I do with the paper towel. It's just at a smaller scale. So I can get into the little areas and move the paint around. Now, speaking of that little brush, this is mostly a dry brush, and I use it to also move paint around. A lot of what I do is move paint around. And remember, guys, if you're sitting and drawing or sitting and painting, every once in a while it's good to get up look at the painting from a distance. See how I kind of leave paint and then I'll go right back into it and adjust it and move it and tweak it. I really enjoy this. That's another thing. My sort of, people ask me a lot, like, how did you develop your painting style? It's so, you know, so unique, this and that. It's, you know, it's stuff that I really nerd out on. That's where it comes from. It's like the things that I obsess over. And over the years, I've just pushed things really far, and then they've eventually kind of led into an actual whole thought process. And my style mostly consists of an actual thought process. And so things like the straight lines, the way that I move the paint around, you know, it's almost like a mindset that leads to a certain style. Now, I think I need a little bit more work on the hair before I get caught up in the face. Why? Because that's what I want you guys to do. And even though I usually don't listen to my own advice, when I'm teaching, I try to. So I'm starting by really focusing primarily on the shape of the hair, not the texture. And then from here, I'm going to, again, come in and adjust the shape a little bit more, a little in here. Like I sometimes intentionally erase too far and then kind of come back. Gives it a more atmospheric, sort of softer edge, and it lends itself to conveying hair a little bit better. You know, you don't want like a completely sharp, cut out edge when you're dealing with hair very often. Now there's also all of this sort of these strands coming into the face. So I'm going to come in and start thinking about that a little bit too. I'm going to see what this does. And then I can use the whole edge, which is the long way, as well. Now, this type of stuff is not completely mandatory. I just think it's super fun, and I get a lot of questions about it, and so I'm trying to share as much as possible. So, you know, mostly doing it for those reasons. I'm not, you know, saying that, you know, using a different tool is magically going to drastically change your painting process or your, you know, efficacy. But, you know, certain tools actually help engage in a specific type of thought process. And that's why I use them a lot. You know, these tools make me simplify just because of how big they are. I'm starting to come in and bring out a few of those smaller shapes. And I'm still mostly focused on placement of those shapes. I'm not getting into really defining them super specifically quite yet. And see how it's not like I'm only using one tool. I just use all these different tools for whatever it seems that you kind of like, whatever it makes sense to me for. It's not a formula, more of like a toolbox that allows me to get the desired effect. And so from here, as I sort of start to close out some of these hair shapes, right, I can basically, I have a few different options. One, I need to flatten the shadow shapes on the hair a little bit. I don't want it to be completely textured everywhere. A few different ways of doing that. You can use like a softer bristle brush, or like a, this is actually like a sable, right? Now, I personally prefer keeping the shadow shapes a little bit flatter, not completely eliminating the texture. And then what I'm going to do is actually come in and bring out the highlights of the hair a little bit more than they are in the image. And I've kind of crinkled up this paper towel, and then I'm coming in and using the edge of the paper towel where my finger is kind of pushing through to erase into. And I'm not pressing too hard because I don't want to completely erase it. I'm just lifting some of the paint. And see how that's starting to imply the form. Because that highlight, even though it's still dark, much darker than the face, is going to help explain the form of the hair. And it also kind of sets me up for this whole area, which is probably going to be the focal point, you know, the hair over the eye. And so I don't want to completely, you know, ignore that area because I think it's important. Now, this is just a smaller straight-edged rubber shaper as well. So now I can come in here and kind of map out some of these separations. And again, especially right here, the edge separation there is very soft. Right, we have all those like little baby strands and things coming out. And so I don't want to actually paint the specific strands, but I'm going to make sure that, you know, the edge here isn't super sharp. And then right here, I'm actually going to make it a little bit sharper so it's not too generic. Okay, guys, any questions at this stage? Go ahead. Because of the way that I decided to simplify things, I'm thinking in terms of the largest shapes that I can sort of create. The largest shape is the shape of the whole head, correct? And then if I'm breaking down what's the next largest, it would probably be the whole block of the hair against the face. And I'm actually also using the edge of these strands to find my sort of drawing here. Because like right now, if you really think about it, the strands are much clearer than even the sort of general cheekbone. And so I can use them to sort of map it out and, kind of triangulate where the cheekbone actually is. Now, that being said, I could have totally painted the cheekbone first. It's just my own sort of like decision of simplification. And it's a strategy, if you may. And it's not only one strategy that works. It's more just important to have a strategy and know why you're doing things and have like a, transitional strategy of one thing leading into another. And I intentionally set out to separate the whole block of hair from the face. And as soon as I decided to do that, I actually just went ahead and did that. And now I'm going to, clarify the shape of the whole head a little bit more before I get into this area. This area is going to be the focal point. And so generally speaking, it's like making a ring. You create the setting for a ring first, and then you put the jewel in. That's the way that I like to think about focal points, is I actually keep away from the focal points the longest and work everything around them, create my sort of foundations, map out all the major shapes, make sure the gesture's working, focus on the proportions, character, even expression. And then I'll really come in and actually build up the focal point past its surrounding areas. So it's almost like you create the setting, the environment, and then you come in and really zoom into the focal point and do something, that's very, very specific and detailed. Mm-hmm. Good. Any other questions? Alrighty then. Again, top of the ear, super important. And so now, like before I get into cheekbone, I would actually start with the ear. And there's like a very, very general approximation of where the ear is, but I want to do something a little bit more specific. I'm not necessarily going to like full on model the ear in this demo, but it would be irresponsible of me not to explain how important, especially with a tilt like this, the ear is really helping define the whole position of the head, right? Also, with a profile, the ear is very often pretty central. So without that ear, you have a face and then a blob. And so in order to even triangulate where the cheekbone is in between the ear and the nose, you want to trust the position of the ear. And so with the ear, I'm mostly focused on position, not necessarily details or character or anything like that at first. I've done paintings where I've almost finished the ear more than anything else, because I actually really like painting ears. But in the beginning, it's really more about placement. Now, I also want to separate the ear from the hair a little bit. And so I'm going to just kind of, this is where paint handling kind of comes in. The way that I apply that paint, I'll leave it to get a little tackier, and so then I can actually make it darker with a softer brush. And see how I just brought that ear out a little bit more without doing much. Now see how I'm not treating the painting as precious. I'm super fine with moving things around, changing things pretty drastically. I think that's very important. As soon as you start really being attached to what's on your canvas or panel or paper, you start to slow down and try to be really careful because you don't want to mess it up. And a lot of times that actually causes you to mess things up. Now, you also don't want to rush. You don't want to be impatient and just throw things around. And so finding that optimal pace to work at is really helpful. Now, right now, and this is sort of addressing the earlier questions with the midtones and things like that, I am going to bring in a tiny bit of yellow ochre into the mix. And I'm basically doing that with the midtones. So like for instance, I'm going to go a little bit warmer. But see how now I can basically come in with something that's not quite as dark, and I'm going to lay down a bit more of a base mid-tone value. And I'm keeping the palette super limited with this one because that's what I want you guys to do. Like, I'll sometimes bring in some phthalo green and some permanent rose at this stage, but I'm just going to keep it to the blue and the yellow ochre to go cooler, because as I was saying earlier, I don't want you guys to get distracted by color. And it can be very distracting, genuinely, for me as well. And I've worked with this palette for a while. You know, it's basically like when you're working monochromatically, you can mix things into each other and move things and erase and redo. When you're working with like different color piles next to each other and you intermix them accidentally, you kind of create mud sometimes. You know, if you take a bunch of blues or greens and you mix them with a bunch of reds, before you know it, you have like this baby shit brown, you know, on most of your painting, and it's not fun, right? I want you to focus on drawing and moving, finding, you know, the location of all these things, and, you know, having a certain integrity to your drawing instead of, you know, treating it like a coloring book. And so the reality of the situation is I'm actually working these into each other. I'm not doing one or the other. I'm basically trying to find how they interact with each other. And that's a sort of good way to think about it, is I'm more searching out interactions than specific areas. Like, I'm right now seeing where this little gap is so that I can clearly define the distance from the nose all the way over here, right? And I'm comparing this width to this one. I'm also comparing this width to this height, because this width is going to define the eye. You know, I'm not actually painting the eye in and then finding the hair strands, because purely visually, when it comes to two-dimensional mapping, the hierarchy is biggest to smallest, not, you know, the features are more important than the hair, than the back of the head. All shapes are equally important. And so the only hierarchy is biggest to smallest. And so what I'm doing is I'm coming from the entire width to approximately like where the center is, or the whole width, then where the ear is, then between the ear and, let's say, this part of the, where the hair ends and the face begins. And then from there, I'm saying between this point and here, where is that? Edge of the hair, edge of the eye. And that edge of the hair, edge of the eye section might actually need to come out a little bit more. It does. And so those are the things that I really want you guys paying attention to. So there's the hair is about there, but then there's that, and I'm going to actually make it warmer intentionally. There's that shadow that the hair strand is casting. And so that's going to push this strand over a little bit. More over here. And again, that's not a huge adjustment, but that's the types of adjustments that you actually want to focus on at this stage, because it's not about making things approximate. We're actually trying to make them work well. Doesn't mean we're trying to copy them, right? We're not trying to be completely literal, but we want to have control over what we're creating. And, you know, it's funny, I say control over what we're creating, but there's an element of like freedom that comes into moving quickly and not even overthinking things. So I think about it as consciously training my subconscious. So you're not trying to think about every single movement or brushstroke. You're trying to train yourself to where you trust the way that you make decisions and then let yourself sort of fly. Okay, now let's take a quick break and screen some questions. Any questions, guys? Go ahead. So the only thinner I've used or medium is the Oleo gel over here. It's on the supply list. I've been using very little of it in the shadows and a little bit more in the midtones. But it's been only the one medium that I've been using. And I used a tiny bit of it from the very beginning. But as I get, see how this is lighter than that? It's the same paint, it's just more of the medium, which allows me to, and it's a different brush. So more medium, different brush allows me to apply it in a slightly thinner, sort of more translucent way. And I can even still come into this and start kind of wiping out lightly. Right? And see how it's kind of similar to what I was doing with the hair, it's just keyed lighter. It's also fun to come in and move stuff around with a dry brush. That's what I'll start doing pretty soon here. Any other questions, guys? So I do use phthalo green later, but I don't use it for this type of stuff. Like, what I'm doing you can do with any colors almost. You just don't necessarily want to start a painting with phthalo blue unless you're doing something that's like literally, you know, stylized blue as the whole color scheme. You know, like I'm using a blue and a brown. You can do what I'm doing with any color scheme. That's kind of what I'm saying. What I've found is that like you don't necessarily want to start with something that's super, super, super saturated, because it just gets overpowering and it's so bright that it's kind of hard to, you know, control subtlety when you're working with neon colors, because what we're really prioritizing is tonal relationships, and we're going to start getting into those even more in a second. And so in order to explain and showcase form, you need to be able to control the relative values. And then there's such a thing called value bracketing, which is basically like, for instance, everything in the hair is going to be darker than anything in the face other than the shadows, right? So even when I go lighter, darker here, the hair is still all darker. Now, when you're coming in with super saturated colors, it's harder to separate things into values, and you start thinking about, you know, saturation, and it's so bright that it's just more difficult to get into subtle tonal relationships. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Great. Any more questions, guys? Super reasonable right now. Yep. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I actually processed this image in Photoshop. I did take the saturation down a bit. And I kind of created a general color scheme. I'm not like being completely accurate to the color scheme, but I decided to, so I kind of created the type of color scheme that I thought would work well for the demo and something that I would actually do, you know, in my own studio work as well. I do full-on Photoshop mock-ups for more complicated paintings. Like if I'm working with a 3-figure painting, I'll do usually like a sketch. Here, I'm gonna flip the camera view. One sec. When I'm doing like a full-on large painting, like even some of these back here, I'll do, like let's say 3-figure painting, I'll basically come in and do like an entire Photoshop mock-up with different images. I'll do sketches. I'll sometimes do a drawing and put it into Photoshop, like anything that you need to do to figure out your composition. When you're just doing a simple portrait study like this too, you could play with the color, the values. Like a lot of time when you're taking, you know, images with a digital camera, the camera is capturing things a little bit differently. So you actually want to know what type of relationships of values and colors you want in your reference and then adjust things a bit. I wouldn't recommend adjusting things crazy amounts. You know, sometimes you see like over-processed images. Don't make the reference look like a photo. You almost want to control the reference so that you can paint it as if you're painting it from life. But Photoshop skills are actually important when you're working from photography a lot. Any more questions? Yeah. Dry. The oleo gel dries a little bit slower than the paint. So I'll actually add more oleo gel if I want to make the paint wet for longer. It also depends on the temperature. Like right now I turn the AC off so that you guys wouldn't have the noise. And to me it feels like the oleo gel is going to dry in 5 minutes. But no, it'll be about 2 days, 2-3 days. And it also depends on the thickness of the paint. It's the type of stuff that you should totally start exploring and experimenting with. The way that I paint, I actually scratch into the paint at different stages, and I like the different tackiness. So I get pretty kind of crazy obsessive with the exact stage that the paint's at, and I do different things to the paint at different stages of drying. So normally speaking, like let's say if you work in layers, you can come in, do a layer, put the painting in on the wall, let it dry for 4 days, and it's usually totally dry. If it's super thin, then it'll be like 1 or 2 days. If you want to do specific things, you actually have to really get to know the paint at different stages of drying time and sort of be aware of what you do for what reason. So like for instance, even some of these initial brush strokes that I made, they are probably going to be a little bit tackier now than at the beginning. And so it's easier to like make even values when the paint's a tiny bit tackier. So I'll sometimes lay down the paint and actually let it just sit there for like 3 hours while I'm painting other areas. And then I'll come back into those areas because I know that the paint is now a little bit tackier and do specific things there. So like I get super complicated. That's kind of what I'm saying with my process. I'll like remember what brush stroke is at what consistency, you know, with what drying time, and sort of plan accordingly. You don't have to paint that way though, and that's kind of why I do something that's like a little bit more of like sculpting with paint almost. I don't even think about it as painting when I'm really getting into my texture. But the oleo gel, think about it as maybe 50% slower drying time than paint. But it also depends on which paint. So for instance, like burnt umber is going to dry super fast, whereas like cadmiums take forever. And so oleo gel dries a little bit more like a cadmium, I would say. Some paintings I will do literally, I'll go on like a 3-day bender and I'll just paint obsessively like 16-hour days, and I'll do it in one session. Some paintings I'll do, like most of them, different stages, different layers. Different parts of the painting will have different layers. Like Some parts of the painting will have 1 layer. Some parts will have 2, and the focal points, let's say, will have 3. I rarely go over 3. Unless it's like a subtle cheekbone area where sometimes I'll glaze subtleties like 5 times. But that's usually in order to deal with a super difficult portion of the painting in a very specific way for a specific aesthetic. Unless you know why you're doing it, it's better to try to limit it to about 3, I would say. It makes you more intentional. When I used to work, I used to not think in terms of stages and layers at all. I would just try to I just keep adding paint until the painting worked. The issue with working that way is you have to oil in a little bit more because, especially when you're working on canvas, certain portions are sunken in, then you paint another area, then it dries, and there's all these little inconsistencies. And so if you're actually working in more of a planned stage way with layers, the consistency is a little bit more even, and it's a little easier to make it look finished. But basically at this point, I think a head and face, I'm going to switch it back to the view. Basically the head and face is starting to be a little bit more blocked in. And but what I mean by that is see how I actually have a kind of a separation between one shape, second shape, and the shape of the whole head, right? So I'm kind of staying on task. And I actually think that that's another thing that's important, and that's why I talk about backing up. You want to be, can you guys mute yourselves if you're not asking a question? Because I can hear some noise. You want to be kind of in control of the process, but you also need to be able to get in the zone and get into the flow state. And so actually physically backing away from the painting helps. Because when you're close up, you could be painting the nose, focus on the nose, doing a great job with the nose, then you can back up and be like, oh, the nose is in the wrong place. And so the paradigm that you're in and solving that local issue is very important. I'm not actually taking anything away from that. But there's a whole other side of painting, which is assigning the correct task to your own brain. And if you think about it that way, I used to actually kind of make jokes where it's you almost have to develop a split personality to be a good artist, because you need to be able to be good at doing something, but you also need to be good at telling yourself what to do. And so it's that back and forth where it's action and then oversight, action and then oversight. I also kind of realized that you almost need a third personality, which is super zoomed out, and that's more of strategy based, which is choosing the actual direction that you even choose to explore in. And so, there's a lot of thought process that actually goes into, really pulling off a full-on painting. So right now that I sort of did a little bit more focus on the head and hair, I'm saying, okay, I need to attach it a little bit more over here so that there's more integrity into that sort of neck connection. And I will sometimes intentionally sort of narrow the neck a little bit, but my biggest advice for that type of stuff is if you're going to adjust proportions, try to find it correctly first and then tweak it. If you think about it, if you know where the shoulder is or the neck is and then you want to adjust it, super doable. But if you don't know where it is before you adjust it, it's a lot of times will just look wrong. Because there's not enough data, or maybe you're exaggerating too much. Now that I've sort of started touching on the neck, I'm gonna come in and try to get this connection working a little bit better. Again, these are areas that I don't necessarily want to put too much effort into, and so those are the things that I actually deal with first. It's almost backwards. As I was saying, focal point comes last. And any area that's going to become like the really worked, detailed, super specific area, those are the ones you actually want to stay away from in the beginning. It's actually super counterintuitive. Our brain wants to come in and really focus on what we consider most important. It's a very natural response to things. It's like, what do you mean? I should focus on the important things, and then I can focus on the non-important things. And there is some truth to that, but the important things is where people get confused, right? Like, what is important? And the most important thing in the beginning is to make all the large shapes work in relationship to each other. That's the most important thing in the beginning. It's not about, like, the eye isn't the most important thing, the nose isn't. Nothing is the most important. It's the relationships of everything that is the most important. I'm not getting into features too much yet, because once I do, I get obsessive. You also have to know yourself. But I am tweaking the general silhouette a little bit more, just to make sure that everything's where it needs to be. Yeah. And see, I'm basically actually trying to solve some of these simplified areas so that I don't actually need to go back to them. Like the areas that you don't want to be the focal point, you also don't necessarily want to spend the whole day on them, because you want time to get into the areas that you actually find interesting. And so getting them out of the way is another way of looking at it. Right? Like, once I start on the features, I'm not going to want to mess with this too much. Once you eat cake, you don't want to go back to your greens. I mean, I do. I like greens, but... So yeah, this over here is a little sloppy. This isn't finished, but it's kind of sort of saying something that isn't the worst. Now over here it's kind of interesting. This comes past the shoulder. So the shoulder kind of comes back here. And again, not the focal point, doesn't need to be like completely defined. I just didn't like it, and so I need to turn it into something that doesn't bother me so that I can move on with my life. Now over here, I'm going to connect this a bit more because it's not so sharp. And I'm going to push this back just a bit. Much better. And that's like, I just really like adjusting things. So my entire process came out of the fact that I like adjusting things. I also started teaching when I was like 15, because it was my dad's art school. And I've adjusted so many drawings and paintings, my own, other students, and like coming in, just quickly assessing what the issue is and adjusting it. That's how my brain works. And so I actually almost intentionally leave things in ways that they need to be adjusted. And then I come through and I almost cycle through. And it's like, I think of it as like a margin of error. You start with a wide margin of error and then you start tightening and tightening till your margin of error is pretty tiny. And so instead of trying to get it working in one pass, you're basically constantly moving around and fixing issues until you don't know where the issues are. And that's usually where I call it solved. There's a difference between a solved painting and a finished painting. Finish has to do with, more than just whether it's working or not. It has to do with like aesthetic, taste, decisions, and things like that. But a solved painting basically means there's no gaping issues. And I go for solved before I worry about finish. And the finish side of things mostly comes out of kind of how I work and just my general process. If you try to solve something within a specific process, it lends itself into eventually into an aesthetic.